I never thought a neighborhood could feel like a battlefield. Manicured lawns hiding quiet wars, white picket fences masking whispered threats. But that's exactly what Oakwood Heights became the moment I dared to stand up to them. It started with something small, something so ordinary it almost felt ridiculous, until it wasn't. Until it spiraled into something darker than anyone could have imagined. People always say every community has that one neighbor, the one who watches everyone, who knows every trash day, every light left on past curfew, every unapproved paint color. But ours didn't just have one. We had an entire council of them, led by a woman who treated our HOA like her personal kingdom. She thought the rules were law, and she was judge, jury, and executioner. And when she decided I'd broken one, my life in Oakwood Heights changed forever. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. A note left on my door, a warning email, a complaint about something trivial. But it didn't stop there. The warnings became fines. The fines became threats. And the threats? They turned into something I still have trouble believing actually happened. They say absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. I saw it unfold on my front lawn, beneath the glare of porch lights and the flicker of phone cameras. The woman who once preached community unity ended up in handcuffs, screaming about protecting the neighborhood as police led her away. But the truth is, that arrest, it wasn't the real story. It was only the ending to a chain of events so absurd, so invasive, and so cruel that even now I struggle to find the words. Because it wasn't just about parking violations or lawn heights. It became about control, about pride, about how far one person would go to make an example out of me, even if it meant breaking the law herself. And as I watched the flashing red and blue lights fade into the night, one question echoed louder than anything else. How did a simple neighborhood dispute turn into a full-blown criminal investigation? And what did it cost everyone involved before it finally exploded? Oakwood Heights was the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Rows of matching houses with identical driveways, manicured lawns trimmed to regulation height, and neighbors who smiled just long enough to hide the calculation behind their eyes. From the moment you turned past the stone entrance sign, engraved with gold lettering and draped in creeping ivy, you could feel the weight of order. Everything in Oakwood Heights was about appearances. The mailboxes gleamed the same shade of black. The shutters had to be one of only 3 approved colors, and even seasonal decorations were restricted to tasteful displays that wouldn't distract from the harmony of the community. It wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a performance, and everyone was expected to play their part. When I first moved there, I bought into the illusion. I told myself that a little order was a small price to pay for safety, for quiet, for the feeling of belonging somewhere stable. I'd spent most of my life in places that were unpredictable, apartment complexes with loud neighbors and peeling paint, streets where you never really knew who lived next door. Oakwood Heights felt like a fresh start. My house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by flowering dogwoods with a small back patio that caught the morning sun. I'd worked hard for it, countless hours of overtime, sacrifices that most people never saw. That little 2-story house wasn't just property, it was proof that I'd finally made it somewhere calm. But calmness, I'd learned, is just silence before the noise. The first person to welcome me was Barbara Thompson. At the time, I didn't know her name, just the way she appeared, almost out of thin air, the day I signed my closing papers. She wore pearls, pastel heels that didn't touch a speck of dirt, and a smile stretched tight enough to hide the steel underneath. She introduced herself as the HOA president, though she said it the way someone might introduce themselves as royalty. She handed me a thick binder, the Community Standards and Bylaws, and insisted I read it, cover to cover. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a high standard of living here," she said, eyes flicking over my car like she was already assessing whether it belonged. Barbara was the kind of person who spoke in rules and regulations, rather than words. She believed deeply in the sanctity of the HOA, not as a form of organization, but as a moral code. And she expected everyone else to believe in it too. "That's how we keep Oakwood Heights beautiful," she'd always say. But what she meant was, "That's how we keep control." Over the next few months, I learned the rhythm of the community, the way lawn mowers buzzed in unison every Saturday morning like a suburban symphony, the way neighbors waved from a distance but never stopped long enough for real conversation. There was an unspoken agreement that privacy existed only until the HOA decided otherwise. Barbara would make her rounds once a week, clipboard in hand, pausing to inspect gutters, mailboxes, and driveways like a general surveying her troops. She never walked alone. Her lieutenants, Carol from Lot 14 and Mitch from Lot 21, usually followed a few paces behind. Carol was the treasurer, a retired bookkeeper with a voice that always trembled on the edge of complaint. She had a permanent scowl that seemed carved into her face, like she'd spent decades perfecting the art of disapproval. Mitch, the secretary, was younger, maybe mid-40s, and had a kind of weary resignation about him. He didn't seem cruel, just complicit, the kind of man who nodded along to Barbara's decrees because it was easier than opposing them. Together, they ran the HOA like a miniature government, complete with meetings, votes, and fines that came with the efficiency of clockwork. At first, I stayed out of their way. I paid my dues, trimmed my hedges, and even attended a few meetings to show good faith. They weren't pleasant affairs. Barbara sat at the head of the table, her binder of regulations open before her, like a holy text, while the rest of us listened to her talk about the vision for Oakwood Heights. Every discussion somehow circled back to maintaining uniformity, as if individuality itself was the enemy. She'd reprimand homeowners for things as minor as hanging a wind chime that was too loud, or using mulch that didn't match the approved color chart. And people followed. They complied, because no one wanted to be the next target. Still, there were small moments, tiny cracks in the facade that hinted at what lay beneath the surface. I remember one evening when a new family moved in at the end of the block. Their kids left a bicycle in the front yard overnight. By morning, Barbara was there, taking photos of the scene like she'd discovered evidence of a crime. The next day, the family received a violation notice taped to their door, along with a $50 fine for unsightly clutter. The bike was gone within hours. So was the family 2 months later. It was easy to dismiss these moments at first. I told myself that every neighborhood had its quirks, that Barbara's obsession with order was just her way of feeling useful. But the more I watched, the more I saw how she thrived on fear, how she enjoyed the discomfort she created. It wasn't about beauty or safety. It was about power. I wasn't immune to her scrutiny. The first time I got a warning, it was for leaving my trash bin visible from the street for longer than permitted. I'd taken it out early the night before pickup and brought it back the following afternoon. The fine was small, $25, but the message was clear. She was watching, always watching. After that, I became meticulous. I made sure every blade of grass was trimmed, every window spotless, every decoration within guidelines. I told myself I wouldn't give her any reason to target me again. But that's the thing about people like Barbara. They don't need reasons. They just need opportunities. It wasn't long before I noticed the little signs that something was shifting. The way Barbara's eyes lingered a second too long when she passed my house. The way Carol's whispers carried through HOA meetings whenever I spoke up with a suggestion. Even Mitch, who usually stayed quiet, began avoiding eye contact altogether. I didn't know it then, but the tension had already started building, slow, invisible, like pressure beneath the ground before an earthquake. And when it finally cracked open, it would take more than fences and rules to contain it. Still, there were good moments, too. My home became my sanctuary. I spent my mornings on the patio, sipping coffee and listening to birdsong, while the rest of the neighborhood stirred to life. I planted flowers, always the approved kind, of course, and learned to find comfort in the predictability of it all. On weekends, I'd wave to neighbors mowing their lawns, trade small talk at the mailbox, and tell myself I was part of something stable. But even in those peaceful mornings, I could feel it, the subtle hum of tension that ran beneath the calm, like the moment before a storm when the air feels too still, too heavy. Barbara's control wasn't just administrative, it was psychological. She knew everyone's secrets, who paid late, who argued with whom, who quietly broke the rules when they thought no one was watching. And she used that knowledge like currency. People feared her not because she had authority, but because she had influence. Then there were the board meetings, monthly rituals where the same small crowd gathered in the clubhouse under fluorescent lights. Every seat faced Barbara, who sat elevated at the front like a judge presiding over her courtroom. She always began with a speech about community integrity, her voice honeyed with false warmth, before launching into the real purpose, a public shaming of anyone who'd fallen out of line. I saw people reduced to whispers, apologizing for flower pots placed an inch too close to the sidewalk, for having a guest park in the wrong direction. And every time someone broke, every time someone promised to do better, Barbara smiled. I learned to stay quiet, to observe, but deep down, I knew that silence only made people like her stronger. One evening, after a particularly heated meeting where Barbara berated a single mother for installing an unapproved mailbox flag, I lingered behind to help stack chairs. That's when I overheard Carol say, "She's getting worse, you know. It's like she enjoys it now." Mitch muttered something about not wanting to get involved, and Barbara turned on them both with a look that could slice through steel. "If you don't enforce the rules," she said coldly, "you're part of the problem." Neither of them said another word. That was the first time I saw it, not just her hunger for control, but her fear of losing it. As the months went by, her obsession grew sharper. She started showing up unannounced, taking photos of driveways and mailboxes for record-keeping. She once measured a neighbor's grass with an actual ruler, claiming it exceeded the permitted length by half an inch. People laughed about it behind closed doors, but no one dared challenge her publicly, because if you did, your name became the next on her list. I remember the night I realized she'd turned her attention toward me again. It was late, almost midnight, and I caught a flash of light outside my window. When I peeked through the blinds, I saw Barbara standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, taking photos of my house. My porch light flicked on automatically, and for a brief second, our eyes met. She didn't flinch. She just lowered her phone, turned, and walked away, like nothing had happened. The next morning, I found another notice taped to my door. Unauthorized exterior lighting installed without approval. It referred to the small solar lights I'd placed along my walkway for safety. I removed them immediately, but the damage was done. From that point on, I knew she'd decided I was her next project. It's strange, looking back, how small things can mark the beginning of something much larger. A notice, a photograph, a glance that lasts too long. Each moment felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern, one I couldn't ignore. By then, I'd started to hear whispers from other residents, quiet complaints shared over backyard fences or in hushed tones at the mailbox. Stories about Barbara fining an elderly couple for leaving their recycling bin out too early or threatening a young family over the color of their patio furniture. But no one wanted to confront her. She knew the bylaws inside out, and she wielded them like weapons. And yet, beneath all her rules and regulations, there was something more dangerous, something personal. I saw it in the way she looked at me during meetings, in how she emphasized my name when addressing violations. I didn't know what I'd done to earn her fixation, but it felt deliberate, calculated. Still, I tried to ignore it. I told myself to keep my head down, to focus on my recovery, though at the time I hadn't yet suffered the injury that would change everything. Life went on as usual, at least on the surface, but that's the thing about control. Once someone like Barbara senses she's losing it, she'll do anything to get it back, and I had no idea that one day soon, a simple act of kindness, something as innocent as allowing a nurse to park in my driveway, would ignite a war that would tear through the heart of Oakwood Heights. Because in neighborhoods like ours, order is everything, until someone dares to challenge the person who defines it, and when that happens, every smiling face, every trimmed hedge, every friendly wave becomes something else entirely. Camouflage in a battleground disguised as suburbia. It began with something so small I almost laughed when I first read it. A letter taped to my front door, the paper sealed in plastic against the morning dew. Printed in Barbara's signature serif font, notice of violation, improper lawn maintenance. I stood there on my porch, still in my slippers, rereading the words in disbelief. My lawn was trimmed to perfection. I'd mowed it just 2 days before, even measured the grass length to make sure it complied with the HOA's recommended range. But apparently, according to Barbara, one section near my walkway was uneven by approximately 1 inch and detracting from community aesthetics. The fine was $50. It should have ended there. I could have paid the fine, grumbled about it, and moved on. But something inside me refused. I'd followed the rules. I had proof. So I sent a polite email asking for clarification. That was my first mistake. Within hours, I received a reply, not from Barbara directly, but from Mitch, the HOA secretary. After careful review, the board stands by its finding, the message read. Further disputes may incur administrative fees. Administrative fees for asking a question. That was when I realized this wasn't about grass. It was about control. And I'd just stepped into Barbara's game. The following week, the letters came faster. Another violation notice appeared for unauthorized exterior decorations. Apparently, the small wreath I hung on my door, a plain, neutral-colored one, wasn't within the seasonal window. Then came one for improper waste bin. Storage, even though mine was tucked neatly beside my garage like everyone else's. Neighbors whispered that Barbara had driven by my house late at night, flashlight in hand, looking for reasons to cite me. One morning, I caught her in the act, crouched near my property line, measuring the distance between my hedge and the sidewalk. When she saw me watching, she smiled, that tight, perfect smile, and said, "Just ensuring compliance." Soon my mailbox became a weapon. Every few days, another envelope appeared, fines, warnings, community reminders. Each one felt heavier than the last, a slow accumulation of pettiness and paranoia. I wasn't the only one either. Carol, the treasurer, started quietly complaining that Barbara was becoming too aggressive. Rumors spread that even Mitch was fed up, but neither dared to cross her publicly. Barbara had something on everyone. Unpaid fines, missing paperwork, rumors of violations no one wanted to test. Then came the landscaping dispute. My front yard had always been simple. A few flower beds, a small tree, nothing extravagant. But Barbara decided my flowers did not conform to the neighborhood's approved palette. Apparently, the HOA had an actual list of acceptable plant species. Azaleas, hydrangeas, and select colors of impatiens. Mine were too vibrant, she said. Too distracting. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't been so exhausting. She issued a notice demanding I remove them within 7 days or face a $200 fine. I refused. That's when the harassment started to feel less administrative and more personal. Anonymous complaints started appearing. A resident reported excessive noise from your property. Your exterior lights remain on past the community's quiet hours. Reports indicate an unregistered visitor vehicle. None of it was true. It was Barbara. I knew it. Every word, every accusation bore her signature, not on paper but in tone, in precision, in cruelty disguised as civility. The breaking point came when she began dragging my name into HOA meetings. A neighbor pulled me aside one morning and said, Barbara had used me as an example during her monthly report, warning others that some residents were becoming disruptive influences. She didn't say my name, but everyone knew. It was humiliating. I'd gone from the quiet, rule-abiding homeowner to the neighborhood's problem child. People I used to chat with at the mailbox stopped making eye contact. Conversations ended when I approached. I could feel the judgment, the whispers. That's how Barbara worked. She didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized perception. Then came the medical incident, the accident that changed everything. One rainy morning, I slipped on water in my kitchen and felt a sharp, tearing pain in my lower back. The doctor said I'd herniated a disc and would need surgery. It went well, but the recovery was long and excruciating. I couldn't move without help. My doctor arranged for a visiting nurse, Sarah, to come by several times a week for therapy and wound care. She was kind, professional, and exactly the help I needed. I wish I could say Barbara respected that. But compassion wasn't in her vocabulary. It started the first day Sarah parked her car in my driveway, a small sedan with her company's logo on the side. She hadn't even made it through the front door before Barbara appeared, clipboard in hand. I watched from the window as they spoke, and even from inside, I could sense the tension. Sarah came in looking unsettled. "Your neighbor says I can't park in your driveway because of HOA rules," she said gently. I laughed, thinking it was a misunderstanding. But then Barbara rang my doorbell, hard, repeatedly. When I answered, she stood there, hair pulled back tight, her expression carved from stone. "There's an unauthorized commercial vehicle on your property," she said. I explained, calmly the more, that Sarah was a nurse, providing medical care under doctor's orders. Barbara's eyes flickered with something sharp. "And she can park on the street like everyone else," she said. "We can't have logos or business vehicles in driveways during daylight hours." I reminded her of the medical exemption in the HOA bylaws. She dismissed it like it didn't exist. "That's not valid anymore," she said, already turning away. "I'll have to make a call." 30 minutes later, the sound of a tow truck reversing into my driveway shattered the quiet. Sarah froze mid-treatment. I hobbled outside, pain shooting up my back, to see Barbara supervising the driver like she was directing a construction crew. I tried to reason with them, but Barbara was relentless. "Rules are rules," she kept saying, as if that justified everything. I showed the driver the exemption myself, printed from the HOA handbook. He hesitated, then unhooked the car and drove off, shaking his head. Barbara's smile vanished, replaced with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming away. It should have ended there, but Barbara was like a dog with a bone. The next time Sarah came, Barbara was waiting, literally sitting across the street in a lawn chair, clipboard ready, like a sentry guarding her territory. She claimed she was monitoring compliance. When Sarah's session ran a few minutes past the hour, Barbara pounced. She marched up to my door, tapping her watch. "Visitor parking limit is 45 minutes, she said. "She's overstayed." I told her she was harassing us. She said she was upholding community standards. I began documenting everything. Photos, emails, timestamps, even video when I could. I thought if it came down to it, I'd have proof. But nothing could have prepared me for how far she'd go. Word spread fast that I'd threatened Barbara. That's what she told the neighbors anyway, twisting my warning about medical interference into an accusation. Suddenly, I was the villain, the aggressive homeowner picking fights with the HOA. A few residents even started siding with her, parroting her words about respecting authority. The isolation became suffocating. Even Sarah began hesitating before each visit, asking if it was safe for her to park. Then came the fines, one after another. Unauthorized visitor parking, non-compliance with HOA correspondence, failure to maintain exterior decorum. The total climbed past $1,000 in under a month. I stopped opening the envelopes. They piled up on my counter like a stack of threats. Barbara escalated further. She began patrolling my street during Sarah's visits, pretending to walk her dog, but never letting me out of sight. One day I caught her photographing Sarah's license plate. When I confronted her, she smirked. "Just documenting recurring violations," she said. I told her she was harassing us. She said, "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about." The absurdity of it all started bleeding into my daily life. I couldn't rest. I couldn't heal. Every sound outside, on every car door, every voice, made me wonder if she was out there again. The neighborhood that once felt safe became a trap. Even inside my own home, I felt watched. And then, just when I thought she couldn't sink lower, she brought reinforcements. One morning, Sarah arrived to find Barbara standing at the end of my driveway with 2 HOA board members beside her, Carol and Mitch. I saw them through the blinds, Barbara gesturing furiously toward Sarah's car. I opened the door to hear her shouting, "This is HOA property. You're trespassing." Sarah stayed calm, explaining that she was there for medical care, but Barbara physically stepped in front of her, blocking her path. When Sarah tried to go around, Barbara shoved her. Not hard, but enough to make her stumble. That's when I called the police. The officers arrived fast. Sarah, ever professional, showed them her documentation, her medical orders, everything. Barbara tried to talk over everyone, insisting she was just enforcing community policy. But when the officers saw the footage, the push, the confrontation, their expressions changed. They took statements, then turned to Barbara. "Ma'am," one of them said, "you've interfered with medical care and physically assaulted a healthcare worker." For the first time, Barbara's confidence faltered. Her voice cracked as she said, "I'm the HOA president." The officer just shook his head. "Not anymore, you're not." They placed her in handcuffs, right there in the middle of the street, in full view of half the neighborhood. People peeked from behind curtains, phones recording. For all her obsession with order, Barbara's downfall was anything but tidy. But even after that day, the story didn't end. The HOA tried to distance itself, claiming Barbara had acted independently. Yet the damage was already done. The board meetings grew chaotic, residents demanding answers, questioning where their dues had gone, why no one had intervened sooner. Carol resigned within a week. Mitch avoided me entirely, guilt etched on his face. And as the days passed, the mail that once carried fines and threats began to carry apologies. Neighbors who'd once avoided me now left notes of support, baked goods, even offers to testify if things went to court. For the first time in years, Oakwood Heights was quiet, not because Barbara demanded it, but because everyone was finally processing what had happened. But peace came slowly. The emotional toll lingered. My recovery was harder than it should have been, not just physically, but mentally. I'd wake up expecting to see another notice taped to my door. Sometimes I'd still hear phantom footsteps outside at night, that faint click of her heels on pavement. In the weeks that followed, the HOA held an emergency election. Barbara was officially removed, replaced by a temporary committee determined to restore community trust. But I couldn't shake the thought of how easily it all happened, how one person, armed with nothing but authority and ego, could unravel an entire neighborhood. Looking back, it wasn't just about power or rules. It was about fear, the kind that seeps into people's lives until they forget they're allowed to say no. Barbara's arrest might have been the climax, but the real story was the slow, suffocating climb that led there. The letters, the whispers, the rules that became weapons, the kind of pressure that doesn't break you all at once, but one paper notice at a time, and somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized that the worst part wasn't Barbara herself. It was how many people let her become what she did. How long they stayed silent while she bullied anyone who dared to breathe differently. By the time the dust settled, Oakwood Heights didn't look so perfect anymore. The lawns were still neat, the mailboxes still uniform, but the illusion was gone. Behind every polished surface, you could sense the cracks, the guilt, the shame, the quiet relief that the tyrant had finally fallen. And me? I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. Because in the end, surviving Barbara's reign wasn't about winning. It was about proving that even in the most perfect neighborhood, control built on fear always collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy. But even now, as I sit on that same porch where it all began, I sometimes wonder if Barbara could fall this far. What happens to the next person who decides to take her place? The days after Barbara's arrest didn't feel real at first. The neighborhood that had once buzzed with her constant patrols and quiet fear had gone strangely still. It was as if someone had cut the invisible strings that had kept everyone upright, obedient, tense. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore, it was cleansing. For the first time in years, Oakwood Heights felt like it could breathe again. But peace wasn't immediate. Chaos filled the vacuum she left behind. The HOA board scrambled to hold itself together, but without Barbara's iron grip, it unraveled fast. Mitch, who'd once hovered nervously behind her during every confrontation, was the first to break. He sent out a public email to every homeowner in the subdivision. I still remember the subject line, a statement of truth. It was long, rambling, but honest. He admitted Barbara had falsified votes, doctored board meeting minutes, and even altered sections of the HOA bylaws without member approval. She'd been holding emergency meetings with only 2 board members, herself and Carol, then presenting the results as binding community decisions. Mitch claimed he'd tried to stop her, that she threatened to have him removed for misconduct. He ended the email with an apology. To those who were targeted, bullied, or fined unfairly, especially you, my name, I am truly sorry. I was complicit through my silence. That email was the crack that split the dam wide open. Within 24 hours, the community message board exploded. Neighbors who'd once kept their heads down came forward with stories. A young couple shared that Barbara had fined them for leaving a baby stroller on their porch. An elderly widow admitted she'd been threatened with foreclosure over a supposedly unapproved ramp installation. Someone even uploaded video clips of Barbara screaming at teenagers for skateboarding in the cul-de-sac. The facade of Oakwood Heights, its perfect lawns, perfect houses, perfect order, crumbled. And in the ruins, people began to see the truth. Barbara's version of perfection had been built on fear. A week later, I was invited to speak at the first open HOA meeting in years. The new interim chair, a retired teacher named Linda, reached out personally. "You don't have to," she'd said gently over the phone. "But I think people need to hear your side. It's time we stop pretending none of this happened." The meeting was held in the community center, the same one where Barbara used to preside from, behind her long mahogany table, like a judge in her own court. Now that table sat empty. The room was packed, standing room only, every seat taken, every wall lined with faces I'd once avoided. Some smiled weakly when I entered. Others looked down ashamed. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled at first. "I moved here because I wanted peace," I said. "I wanted to live somewhere safe, quiet, stable. I never thought I'd find myself fighting my own neighborhood for the right to exist in it." I talked about the first letter, the fines, the harassment, the day Barbara tried to tow my nurse's car, and then, finally, the arrest, the moment when her illusion of authority shattered under real law. As I spoke, I saw faces shift from guilt to anger to disbelief. People weren't just listening. They were waking up. When I finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then someone started clapping. It spread soft at first, then louder, until the whole room joined in. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in Oakwood Heights. I felt seen. In the weeks that followed, the consequences came hard and fast. The county prosecutor charged Barbara with harassment, falsification of records, and obstruction of medical care. Her attorney tried to argue it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd been acting in good faith to enforce HOA rules. But the evidence told a different story. The doctored meeting notes, the illegal fines, the emails she'd sent threatening homeowners with removal. The judge didn't buy a word of her defense. Barbara was sentenced to 6 months of community service and a year of probation. She was also banned from serving on any homeowners association board for life. The irony was poetic. She'd built her entire identity around controlling this neighborhood, and now she couldn't legally touch one again. But the real punishment wasn't her sentence. It was her fall from grace. The woman who once stood as the self-proclaimed guardian of order was now the subject of every whispered conversation, every shared headline. People avoided her house like it was cursed. Her name became shorthand for tyranny. "Don't go full Barbara," neighbors would joke when anyone got too nosy about trash cans or paint colors. Meanwhile, Oakwood Heights began its slow rebuild. The HOA bylaws were overhauled from the ground up. Residents voted to dissolve several outdated restrictions, including the invasive inspection policy Barbara had abused. For the first time, homeowners had a real voice. Meetings were recorded and publicly posted. Fines had to be approved by a majority vote, and all funds were now transparently tracked. It wasn't perfect, no system ever is, but it was fair. And fair was something we hadn't seen in a long time. As for me, I finally started to heal, physically and emotionally. My back surgery recovery had stalled during the chaos, but now, without the constant stress, I began making real progress. Sarah, my nurse, still came by a few times a week, though now we laughed about the absurdity of it all. "I've been in war zones with less tension than this street used to have," she once said, shaking her head with a grin. Neighbors who'd once avoided me now waved when they passed. Some even stopped by to check in, bringing coffee or baked goods as peace offerings. A few of them admitted they'd been afraid to stand up to Barbara, that they'd convinced themselves keeping quiet was safer. I understood. Fear does strange things to people. But the most surprising part came one afternoon, about 2 months after the trial. I found an envelope in my mailbox, plain white, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. I was wrong. I let my fear of losing control destroy everything I thought I was protecting. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know. I see it now. You were right. B, no apology could erase what she'd done, but reading it, I felt something unexpected pity. Barbara had built her world so tightly that the moment someone challenged it, it collapsed and took her with it. Maybe deep down, she'd started as someone who wanted to make things better. Maybe the power just hollowed her out until there was nothing left but the need to dominate. I folded the note and placed it in a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder. Life slowly returned to normal. The HOA no longer felt like a threat. It felt like what it was supposed to be, a group of neighbors managing shared spaces, not policing private lives. The sound of kids playing outside replaced the hum of Barbara's nightly inspections. The lawns weren't all perfectly identical anymore, some a little longer, some dotted with flowers that hadn't been approved, and somehow it all looked more alive. The tension that once gripped every conversation dissolved into something softer, more human. People began helping each other again, sharing tools, hosting barbecues, borrowing sugar. For the first time, the community felt like one. There was a day, about 6 months after Barbara's arrest, when I stood at the end of my driveway and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't scan the street for her car. I didn't brace for another violation notice. I just stood there, watching the sunset glow across the rooftops, listening to laughter drift through the air. That was the moment it hit me. The real victory wasn't her downfall. It was the freedom that came after. Of course, the story didn't just disappear. News outlets ran features about the HOA president gone rogue. A few even reached out to me for interviews, but I turned them down. I didn't want 15 minutes of fame. I just wanted peace. Still, the story spread, and it became something bigger than Oakwood Heights. People from other neighborhoods wrote to me, complete strangers, sharing their own horror stories about HOAs gone mad. Some were heartbreaking. Elderly couples bullied over mailbox colors, veterans fined for displaying flags, families threatened for building wheelchair ramps. I realized then that what happened here wasn't unique. It was systemic. It was what happens when unchecked power meets petty pride. One message stuck with me. It came from a woman in another state who said she'd been battling her HOA for months over accessibility modifications for her disabled husband. After watching your story, she wrote, I decided I wasn't going to be bullied anymore. I called a lawyer. I'm fighting back. That's when I understood the impact. This wasn't just my story. It had become a warning, a rallying cry for anyone who'd ever been told they had to stay quiet because rules are rules. In a strange way, Barbara had become the symbol of everything wrong with that mentality. And I, accidentally, had become the proof that standing up mattered even when it felt impossible. Months turned into a year. Barbara moved away quietly. No one knew where, and few cared. Her house sold, but it sat empty for months before a young couple moved in. They seemed nice, friendly, eager to start fresh. The first time they introduced themselves, they laughed nervously and said, We've heard stories. I smiled and told them, Don't worry. It's different now, and it was. One afternoon, I walked past the old community board near the entrance of Oakwood Heights, the one where Barbara used to post her rigid reminders in all caps. Now it was filled with flyers for neighborhood picnics, charity drives, and lost pets. Someone had even pinned up a handwritten quote, Community is built on compassion, not control. I don't know who wrote it, but I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Maybe it was corny, but it was true. Eventually, the HOA formally restructured under state oversight. An external audit revealed Barbara had embezzled small amounts of community funds. nothing massive, but enough to pay for administrative supplies that didn't exist. The restitution order required her to repay every cent. The new bylaws mandated transparency, annual elections, and public access to all financial records. It wasn't just about justice, it was about prevention. As for me, I found peace in the small things again, gardening, sitting on my porch without anxiety, waving to neighbors instead of avoiding them. I even replanted the same flowers Barbara had once deemed too vibrant. They bloomed brighter than ever that spring, wild and unapologetic, their colors spilling over the neat edges of the walkway. Every time I looked at them, I thought about how control and beauty rarely coexist, that sometimes what makes a place truly worth living in are the imperfections people once tried so hard to erase. There's one moment that stays with me. A few months after everything settled, I was outside watering those flowers when an elderly man walking his dog stopped in front of my house. "You're the one who stood up to her, right?" he asked, smiling. I nodded, a little embarrassed. He chuckled softly. "Good. It's about time someone reminded folks that rules are supposed to protect people, not punish them." Then he walked on, and I just stood there, feeling that truth sink in deeper than any victory ever could. Oakwood Heights wasn't perfect now, but it was free. And that freedom, hard-won and fragile as it was, felt like the truest kind of home. Sometimes, when I sit outside at dusk and watch the streetlights flicker on, I think about how thin the line really is between order and oppression, how quickly community standards can turn into personal vendettas, how easily good intentions can rot when nobody dares to question authority. And I wonder how many other neighborhoods out there are still living under their own Barbara, too afraid to speak up, too tired to fight? Because if I learned anything from all of this, it's that silence doesn't keep the peace. It only feeds the monster that lives behind it. So maybe the next time someone tells you it's just the rules, you should ask them, whose rules, and who really benefits from keeping them?